Hi, I'm Tom Payne again, back to talk to you about some research that we've been conducting, and Dr. Fan has actually been done in 3 countries, and talking to people, primarily candidates, to find out what their experience has been, and to talk to also employers and say what's working and what's not working well in your selection process. So in Fan's research, he's identified what we call 12 common pitfalls in the selection process. So I'm just going to walk you through those and see if any of these resonate with you. I'm sure that some of you will cringe a bit when you hear them. First one is something we've talked about in a couple of the episodes already, which is a lack of alignment and focus on the hiring criteria. This gets to the whole topic of training people how to do interviews. And as we've alluded to several times, training for interviewers is necessary because it's not a natural God-given talent that people have. People may be good at conversations, but that's not the same thing as being good at interviews. So there is a target that interviews all have, and the target is to look for the competencies that have been identified that are closely associated with successful performance on the job. So the importance of number one, having every interviewer focus on those things and know what kinds of questions to ask. That's one aspect of alignment. The other aspect of alignment is having all the people who are on the hiring manager's teams aligned with what are those competencies that we're looking for? What are the questions we're going to ask? How do we not repeat ourselves with the candidate so that we bore the candidate by asking the same question 3 different times? And so that when we get together to talk about our observations and our assessment of the candidate, they're done in a professional and aligned way, which provides clarity to the selection decision. So, number one thing that Fan had found in talking to candidates and talking to hiring managers is that there's oftentimes this lack of alignment on the focus of the hiring criteria. And so, alignment means two things primarily. One is have the criteria been identified? That's number one. And number two, does everybody know and understand what those things are? So that during the interviewing process, we make sure we cover all those. So that was one of the first things that they uncovered, which was something that uh, interferes with the selection process in the interviewing. Second thing was a lack of professional vetting in the selection criteria. Now, well, that's a little bit different than talking about the competencies. What Fan had recognized is that uh, people are saying, okay, we need these elements in the selection process. So we have one is a screening interview, another one is 3 one-on-one interviews, another one is a personality test, another one is a skills test, another one is a cognitive abilities test, and a fourth one or fifth one, for instance, could be a work simulation, which would be a problem solving exercise. So, give you an example of that. There are people who say, "Well, look, we need to have interviewing training, so let's organize that." But the interviewing training is not focused on structured interviews. It's not focused on getting after the competencies that are needed and necessary. So there are lots of different kinds of interviewing training, and you got to make sure that the one that is selected is going to be useful to your team in terms of making a decision and getting the best information you can about the suitability of the candidate. When we the process of the interview itself is designed to predict future performance of the candidate, and that's the goal. It's about prediction. So when we talk about prediction, we say we want to check on three things. Number one, can this person do the job? Number two, are they motivated by their interest and professional development to do the job? And number three, will they fit with the rest of the team? So it's can do, will do, and fit. And so, in pursuit of those three goals, the first thing is interviewing training. The second thing is there are some selection assessment tools like cognitive ability or personality that should be used because they do add value. They do help us better understand the candidate's motivation and the candidate's ability to fit in with the rest of the team. There are a wide variety of assessment tools out there that are available. Most of them are no good at all. I hesitate to say that, but as an industrial organizational psychologist myself and having gone through graduate school, what was very clear to me is that the personality tests that are Big Five related or Big Five based focus on behaviors at work. They're not designed for clinical psychology or family therapy or any of those things. They're designed for the world of work. And that is what all the professional organizations within industrial organizational psychology will tell you is you should use a Big Five based personality test. And the other thing is that in terms of cognitive ability should be a multifaceted test. And the typical uh, tests of cognitive ability include a verbal, numerical, and abstract reasoning. And lately, the concern, professional, especially when applied internationally, has been the inclusion of the verbal because the verbal is involves a lot of text, a lot of translations, and all of cognitive ability tests are timed, meaning that you have 20 minutes or 30 minutes or 15 minutes or some time limit. They're kind of like a graduate record exam or an IQ test. They're testing how fast you can come up with the right answer. So the more answers that you get correct in the allotted time, the higher your score. So there are a couple things you should know about cognitive ability tests. Is number one, once you get past 50 years of age, your random access memory, your brain's ability to go out and find a particular file and bring it back in and use it, slows down. So using cognitive ability tests for candidates that are over 50 is probably not going to give you as accurate a reading as if you'd given it to them when they were 35 or 40. The other one is that using having a verbal component to the cognitive ability test is problematic if you're using it internationally because it has to be translated. As a result of it being translated, the translations are not always perfect. And if the person who's reading this text and then has to answer questions about that text, if they're not totally understanding if it doesn't make sense to them, it slows them down and their score goes down. So a lot of cognitive ability tests have now settled on two facets, and that's just fine. Numerical and abstract reasoning are kind of the gold standard that people use, and understanding that all cognitive ability tests are timed. Personality tests are not timed. They don't need to be timed. So in terms of picking the right assessment tools to use, it's important that people know and understand what the tests are, how they should be used, and how they shouldn't be used. So, for instance, the most famous personality test in the world is the Myers-Briggs Types Indicator called the MBTI. The MBTI is famously put into its test manual that this test should not be used. It can be used for many different things, but it shouldn't be used in selection decisions. So, unfortunately, a lot of people don't adhere to that and are misaligned, and they use the MBTI in a selection or a promotion context, and it's generally frowned upon. You'll find most of the literature in IO psychology says it's not a valid or reliable test to be used in those settings. Now, the other things that are sometimes included are tests of software acumen. So, for instance, the Microsoft suites are oftentimes used for people who are in roles where they're doing a lot of analysis. and data gathering. So, or they're preparing PowerPoints, or they're using a lot of Excel, or they're using a lot of database um, tools to put together analysis. And so those tests are germane as long as they are job related. Giving a software test to a director or vice president is probably not a very clever idea, because most of the time they're not doing those things themselves, or somebody in their organization is doing it for them, and they have to know how to do it. Um, and the other one is that, and these tests are highly interesting. They're referred to as simulations. They come out of the same science that assessment centers have. So they're kind of like snippets of an assessment center. They're single exercises out of an assessment center. So when I was involved as a sales manager many years ago, one of the tests I used to, or one of the things I used to do, was to hand somebody, for instance, a pen and say, okay, I'm going to give you this pen, and in 5 minutes, I want you to sell me this pen. Now that wasn't a very professionally well organized test. Eventually, we refined it a bit, and we got rid of the pen, and we gave them some products that they had to read about and make a presentation on. And that was considered to be a lot more interesting and valuable in terms of having people actually demonstrate the skills that they had developed in their previous jobs. Those kinds of work sample tests are highly interesting. My only caution, and the thing that we found in working with clients on those, is that there are some people who become so attached because they like those things. They become so attached to them, it becomes their primary criteria for whether or not they're going to hire somebody or not. It's like the interview, personality tests, cognitive ability tests, other things, reference checks are not as important to the people making the decision as the work sample test. So you have to understand the work sample test is a valuable piece, but it's only a piece. And when you are using things like that, if you allow it to take over the selection decision, don't tell me about anything else. How did they do on the sales simulation? Don't tell me about anything else. Tell me how they did about the business case solution. Then you'll know that you've got one element of the selection process is overriding everything else. So just be careful. I guess our message here is be careful that when you are using these things, that some of these things don't become so important that they override the interview and the reference check and everything else. The other thing that happens is that there is a lack of trust in the process that leads to a fear of making a decision. So if the selection criteria and the sequence of gathering information is not clearly understood and not clearly agreed to by everybody who's involved in interviewing the candidate, then people start to lose trust because they don't necessarily understand what the process is designed to do. So as a result of that lack of trust, it becomes very difficult to make decisions on candidates. We're going to present some research later on in these podcasts that's going to talk about the number of interviews that you should limit yourself to in a selection process, because actually you get a deleterious effect or a declining impact the more interviews that you add. It wears out the candidate, and it makes the decision making just that much more complex. And part of that is just a lack of trust in the process. Fourth thing is, and I've alluded to this before, the over reliance on one or two of the elements. So, for instance, some people will hone in on the cognitive ability. They want to know how the person scored on that, and then they want to take a look at how they did in the business simulation. And if you look at the totality of the selection process, all of those elements have been added step by step in a certain order, in a certain sequence. Each of them builds predictive credibility one upon the other. So you start off with basically zero predictability, and by adding these things carefully and thoughtfully, excuse me, you can get up to about 70% accuracy in your selection decision, which is pretty reliable and pretty good, and it's what most people ought to be aiming for. So the other thing that don't focus on one or two elements of the selection process. Look at the whole thing in total, and where is it taking you? What is it telling you about the candidate? Um, the other thing is that we all approach these processes with a certain amount of personal bias. Personal bias can be how attractive the candidate is, how tall the candidate is, whether the candidate is a male or a female, anything, what nationality they are, what school they went to, um, what companies they've worked for. All of these things can create a bias in us that is really not relevant to making the decision. So you can consider these things, but the reason that we have three interviewers involved typically in the process is so that you get this diversity of opinion, and therefore it tends to counteract the biases of any one individual. The other thing I would add to that is it's very important when the interviewers get together that they get together and agree to listen to each other as to the information that's collected. Steve Jobs and other people have said interviewing is not an individual sport, it's a team sport. And I believe in that thoroughly. It takes a team to make a good hiring decision, but a team of three or four, not a team of 8 or 10. That tends to work against making good decisions. The other one is the time pressure to fill positions. So oftentimes when you lose somebody, particularly in a key role, and you say, what's a key role? Well, they're all key roles, actually. But if you're getting to month end closing and your controller has quit, and you know that people are going to have to be working overtime in order to get the month end numbers in, and you can't call up and say, well, I can't do the month end closing for a couple of weeks. That's got to be done. It's kind of sacrosanct that you got to close the books. So there may be a rush to say, oh my heavens, we have to hire somebody quickly and just get a warm body into that accounting team so that they can finish the books. You're probably better off calling and asking for help from another unit or a temporary help agency or something like that than trying to rush to fill a position. That is almost always a mistake. And as much as you can do to alleviate yourself from the time pressure of filling a position, the better. The other one is that there's a lack of coordination among interviewers and no set schedule for candidates. So what happens is when the interview team, if there are three or four interviewers, are selected to participate, they have to raise their right hand, take an oath that they're going to be there on the day at the time that the interview is scheduled. There is literally nothing more important that they have to do that day at that time. Nobody should be canceling out of interviews unless there's an absolute and utter emergency. But by and large, the reason that the people were asked to interview is because they are trusted, they're knowledgeable, and their contribution to the hiring process is needed and necessary at that time. So the interviewers need to be committed, and you just have to run it that way. So um, the interviewers and the candidates all have to show up at the same time on the same day in order for the whole process to work. So sometimes candidates back out. That happens, and that can't be avoided. If it happens, then you just go on with the next candidate. The other one is that they should all be interviewed on the same day, where at all possible, even if it has to be a Zoom or a Skype or whatever interview. The interviews should happen within a day-long period. And the reason for that is people's memories, by the next day, they've forgotten things, they don't remember everything. And if you spread out the interviews over 2 or 3 weeks, where they interview with one person on this week, another person the next week, another person the next week, and then you get those three people together again, the person who interviewed 3 weeks ago can barely remember the person at all. So you want to be able to get, in order to get the best decision made and the most useful information, schedule the interviews on the same day, and then hold the candidate review meeting directly after the last interview is finished. And in that way, you preserve the integrity and the ability to remember all the specific examples that the candidate shared. That's incredibly important. Uh, the other one is along with that, is that where HR can come back into the process. So HR's got two key roles in the interviewing process. Number one, they work with a hiring manager. They help them set up the criteria. What are the things we're going to be looking for? How are we going to what questions are we going to ask the candidates? Who's going to ask the candidate what questions? How are we going to evaluate the candidate's responses? And then the second thing that they're going to do is screen the candidates, unless you've got a professional search firm and in that case, they do the screening. The last thing that the HR team can do, they shouldn't be involved in the face-to-face interviews. That's for the hiring manager and the hiring manager's team. And those should be one-on-one interviews. They shouldn't be panel interviews. Those are terrible. Don't do them. But they should be one-on-one interviews. And the reason for that is that there are two decisions that are being made in the process of the interview. One is, do we want to hire this person? And the other one is, does this person, that's their decision, does that person want to work for us? So as a result of having the three one-on-one interviews, they develop a certain level of rapport with the interviewers. And that's extraordinarily valuable. And a lot of times that's overlooked. In the end, HR comes in and they gather the three interviewers together and they say, okay, the three of you all interviewed this candidate. Let's start at the top, go down competency by competency, and tell me about what you learned about this candidate in terms of their can do, will do, and fit. And if you do that all within the same day, you're going to find that the quality and quantity of the information is sufficient for you to have confidence in the decision that that team makes. And you can actually make a decision at the end of that day. Now, you may have other candidates that are still waiting to be interviewed, but you can score that candidate and keep the scores and say, okay, now I've got this memorialized and I know what I want to, I can compare the next candidate that I interviewed to this one because I've already got the scores for this one. One of the other ones that happens is remember that when you invite candidates in, you should be hospitable and respectful and treat them with respect and treat them with hospitality. Don't become arrogant. Just because you have the job does not mean that you are the one in power and you can end the interview early if you want, or if you invite somebody in the interview, stick with it, go through the whole hour, interview the person, turn them on to the next person. The worst thing that can happen, and I've seen it happen in organizations, they come in, they sit down with the first interviewer, and the first interviewer goes about 10 or 15 minutes and says, well, thank you very much. I've got all the information I think I need. You're supposed to be with them for an hour. You've been with them 10 minutes, and the interviewer's already made their mind up, and the candidate doesn't know what to do next, but they sure feel bad about themselves. And that ruins the whole process, because you don't know whether or not that was the bias of that one interviewer or if the candidate was actually that bad. If the candidate was actually that bad, that feedback needs to be given to HR because they didn't do, or the search company because someone missed the boat in terms of the screening process. 3 more to go. No standard or disciplined selection process for all candidates. So, for instance, if you're bringing people in and they have to take a personality test, cognitive ability test, They go through, this is following the screening. They come in for 3 one-on-one interviews, and then they go through the candidate review, and then they go through a reference check cycle. So, in the case where someone didn't get a chance to complete the online assessments, and there is no online assessment, then somebody says, well, that's okay. We don't need to do the personality test or the cognitive ability. I think they're smart enough. Let's just go with the interviews. Don't get yourself talked into that. Make sure that you follow the quality management principles, which are if you have a process, you follow it religiously all the way through to the end. And then you take the results of that, and then you know it's a reliable and valid process. There's no quality control over selection elements. um, and by that, and this is where HR plays a very important role. HR's role is to help you find the right kind of test or assessment tools, and they should be providing the interviewer training for the hiring manager's team. So those things are left to HR, and it's up to them to choose the right kind of training for the hiring managers to go through to help them prepare the interview guides and to make sure that the tests that you give to the candidates are valid and reliable and useful in the selection context. The last one is reference checks. Every year, you can pick up one of the major trade magazines, Wall Street Journal or New York Times or whatever, Fortune magazine, and read the horror stories about somebody who didn't do a reference check. And lo and behold, the person who told you that they graduated with Harvard with an MBA was actually in a mental institution or in prison during those 4 years and had none of the things they said they did. So what the research shows us is that about 1/3 of all the information provided by candidates on either a CV or application, or even during the interview, is not correct. It's in error in some way, shape, or form. So, and the same thing happens with personality tests. We only used personality tests, which are number one, Big Five based, as I mentioned, and number two, they should have a response fidelity measure in them. So if the person is being inconsistent in their responses, or they are claiming virtues that they don't really possess, or they're trying to make a valuable impression, that the person who's interpreting the results of that test is seeing that and knows that, hey, this may not accurately represent this person's personality. Now, you don't do that kind of response fidelity checking on a cognitive ability test. It's not necessary. But for personality tests, it is. So reference checks are very important to be used. As I say, it verifies at a minimum. You want to check the university degrees that they claim they got and grade point averages that they got. You check with the institutions. In order for you to get that, you have to have a candidate sign a release form, because if you don't have them sign a release form under the Data Protection Act of most countries, that educational institution or previous employer will not be able to share any information with you. So make sure as part of your candidate vetting process, you ask the candidate to give you written permission, should they be wanting to make an offer to you, to check your educational institutions and past work history. That's it. Those are the 12 pitfalls.